Welcome to Basic Selection Techniques in Photoshop. I'm Varis, your host for this examination of basic Photoshop techniques, which is part of the Photoshop Layers Fundamentals course. Many times we encounter situations in our photography where we need to make some adjustment or correction in a smaller part of an image. We may need to lighten a shadow or make the eyes a little more blue or lift something off of its background and substitute another. Whenever we need to affect a portion of the overall image without affecting anything else, we need to make a selection. There are many different ways of selecting things in Photoshop, and there are many different uses for selections. This step-by-step tutorial will examine how to create and modify selections, how to edit selections using the Quick Mask mode, how to save and use selections in channels and layer masks, how to isolate an object and drag it from one document to another, how to apply selections to layer masks, how to stretch, scale, and otherwise transform selections, and finally, how to rotate and transform objects in layers. So, without further ado, let's get into Photoshop and learn about basic selections. Okay, so here in Photoshop, I've got a blank page, and I'm going to start by making a selection. Our selection tools here are at the top, underneath the Move tool. So this first one is the Marquee selection tools, and we have rectangular marquee, elliptical marquee, and these two kind of special use ones which select a single pixel row and column. And then we have the lasso tools, which are the regular lasso tool, the polygon lasso tool, and something called the magnetic lasso tool. And finally, we have the sort of auto-select tools here, the quick selection tool and the magic wand tool. So let's start with the basic rectangular selection. And if I want to isolate a portion of this page, I can click and drag a selection, and we can see the selection is identified by what's called the marching ants, which go all the way around. And as you can see, when I move the cursor inside, it changes to indicate that this part is selected and the outside is not. This part selected, outside is not. If I invert the selection, so I go select inverse, now the outside is selected. You can see how the cursor has changed, and the inside is not. Okay, so let's select that. Let's inverse it back. So now we have to modify selections all the time. We can't always get it right the first time around, so you have to know how to add or subtract to a selection. So if I hold down the Option or Alt key, you'll notice how the cursor changes to have a little minus sign next to it. That means I'm going to subtract from the selection. I just kind of corral an area, sort of enclose an area that I want to subtract from the selection, and when I do that, I can see now my selection shape has changed because I've subtracted this whole other quadrant here. I can add to a selection by holding down the Shift key, and you see the cursor changes with a plus, and I can drag a portion out, and that will now be added to the existing selection. Okay, so sometimes it is useful to visualize the selection with what's called a quick mask. So right now we see marching ants, and a way of visualizing what this mask would look like is to use the quick mask. Here's a little icon down here at the bottom of the tool panel, and if I click on that, we will toggle into quick mask mode. And quick mask mode usually indicates with a color of some kind. In this case, the color is indicating what is selected. We can go over here into the Channels panel and click on the flyaway menu here in the upper right corner of the Channels panel and select Quick Mask Options. And this is where we get to control how our selection is visualized. So I usually change it from having the color indicate the selected areas to having the color indicate the masked areas. And we can change the opacity of our color. Let's say instead of 50%, let's say 60%. It'll make it a little bit darker. Okay, so now the mask here, the masked areas are darker. The selected area is white or clear. We would be seen through the selection to whatever's underneath it. In this case, it's just a white page. One of the advantages of having a quick mask is that we can edit the selection using paint tools. So for instance, I can get a paintbrush here, and if I paint with black paint, I am going to subtract that portion from the selection. If I paint with white paint, I am going to add to the selection. So the white areas are selected, and the sort of ruby pink areas are the masked areas. I can toggle off that quick mask mode just by hitting this little icon, or I can toggle hitting the Q key. So if I hit the Q key, I go into quick mask. If I hit it again, I'm out of quick mask, and we see the marching ants. Now, one thing you may notice here is when we're in the marching ants view, it's almost impossible to tell if there's any sort of soft edge. If I go to quick mask, you can see that where I painted with a soft edge brush, the selection actually has a soft edge. The rest of this has a hard edge, and I can very clearly see the character of the edge when I'm in quick mask mode. Now, I have a selection, and whenever there's an active selection, you can only operate inside the selection. I'm going to go ahead and change my paint color here. I'll show you what I mean. I now have a paintbrush. I'm painting with 100% opacity, 100% flow. If I'm painting outside of the selection, I can paint until the cows come home and nothing will happen. I can only affect the inside of the selection. So let's paint inside the selection here. Right? So wherever I'm going into the selection with a paintbrush, it's showing up. So I can paint all the way around here, and it's only going to allow me to paint inside the selection. Now, another thing you might want to do occasionally is hide the marching ants, so you can see the effect of your paint job without the marching ants and without having to drop the selection. So we achieve that by doing a Command or Control H, which will hide the marching ants, and now I can kind of see the effect without the distraction of the marching ants. Now, I'm gonna undo all my painting here. I'm just gonna Command Z this so that we go back. Before I do anything with a selection, I usually like to save the selection just in case I drop it or something happens. I can always retrieve it, or I might want to use it in a different way on a different layer, for instance, than whatever I have selected now. So let's save the selection. I go to the Select menu, and I save the selection. I get the Save dialog, and I can give the new channel, this is the default for saving a selection, is making a new channel, and I can give the channel a name, and I'll call it Mask. You can name it anything you want. It's telling you it's making a new channel. Okay. Now, where did that selection go? Let's take a look. So here's the selection. It's in what's known as an alpha channel, which is the extra channel beyond red, green, and blue, which make up our color. Extra channels are used to store selections. Okay, so I can now drop the selection by Command or Control D. Now I don't have the marching ants anymore, but I still have my mask. If I go back to my RGB, nothing is there. And certainly if I paint now, I can paint anywhere because there's no selection active. So if I want to retrieve the selection that I saved, I can come down here to the mask in the channels panel and Command or Control click on it. And that will bring back my my marching ants. Another way, if you can't remember the keyboard shortcut, Command or Control and click, you can select the mask, highlight it here, and then click on the little load channel as selection icon at the bottom of the channels panel, and that will load the selection. Then we can go back, and now in our document I can paint into this. Let's look at a few other things that we can do with the selection in the quick mask. So again, I can toggle the quick mask by clicking on this. I can now, let's say I wanted to soften the edge of this. Okay. If you have a selection, let's toggle back out of this. If you have a selection, you can do all kinds of things to the selection from the select menu. I can come down here to modify, and I can select feather. Feather would be a way of softening the edge, and I can type in a radius here and it will soften that edge. Unfortunately, there's no indication in the marching ants how soft that really is going to be. The marching ants always sort of goes right through the middle of a soft edge, and you can't tell really how soft the edge is. So I generally prefer to do my softening when it's in quick mask mode, so hitting the Q key, and then I can use any filter on this quick mask. So I'll go to Blur, Gaussian Blur, and now I can decide, did I want a 5-pixel radius or did I want something more? So I can actually see how soft the feather radius is going to be. Now sometimes, and we'll see this in operation when we get to our practical application of this, sometimes I want this selection to expand. If I want the selection to expand, I would, let's look at that without quick mask. If I have a selection here and I want it to expand, I could go to the select menu, modify, and expand. And type in a number and it would get a little bit bigger. Again, it's kind of, especially if you have a soft edge in there, it's sort of hard to see how that might line up on an image. So again, I would prefer to do this in quick mask mode, and our expand and contract filters in quick mask mode would be maximum or minimum. Maximum will spread the highlights. So I can get the maximum dialog up here, and you can see if I add more and more radius, it fattens out the selected areas. It's sort of spreading the highlight areas into the darkness. Okay. Conversely, if I pick a filter other minimum, I can get the selection to get smaller by the radius value. So I can really trim in this selection just by changing the radius in the minimum filter. Okay, let's go out of quick mask mode. There's one other thing that we can do with selections, and that is transform them. If I go to the select menu and do transform selection, I get this bounding box with little control handles. You can see if I put the cursor over these little handles, you can see that I can click and drag these things. So I can change the size of the selection. I can also rotate it. So there's a lot of control over the selection even after we've made the selection. We can always alter it just a little bit, and this kind of stuff comes in handy. I'm not going to do anything with this now. Okay, so that's the basics of adding to a selection, making a selection. All the tools, the sort of freehand drawing tool for selections is the lasso. And again, if I wanted to add to it, I'd hold down the Shift key and I can make a sort of an arbitrary shape here. If I wanted to subtract, hold down the Option key, and you have to kind of enclose a whole area to subtract. And so you have these sort of freehand drawing. The polygon lasso tool, it works like kind of a rubber band type of thing. So again, holding down the Option, I click and I get these sort of little stretchy rubber bands, and I can make these sort of straight edged selections. And you can see as I go back to the end, it changes, and that's going to complete the selection and subtract that one little bit. And we're going to look at the auto select tools in another tutorial here in a minute. Okay, so now that we've seen the basic selection methods, let's look at a practical application that gets us to our first use of layers. All right, so we're going to ignore this for a minute, and let's look at a sort of practical application here. I've got a picture here of the synagogue band, and the rabbi is right there in the middle, and he's looking pretty good here, but a lot of the other people are, they don't have as pleasant an expression. They're not looking in the right directions. This guy over here doesn't count because he's blind. But there's another shot here taken at the same time where the rabbi kind of doesn't look very good here, but everybody else has a nice expression, or as good as we're going to get with this group here. So my challenge is to take the head, the rabbi's head from this shot, and put it into this shot. And this is something that's really easy to do, and you'd be surprised how often you'll be called on to do this. So we're going to start by making a selection around the rabbi's head. Now we're going to use the good head and put it into the other document. So I'm going to zoom in here. This is a fairly low res. It's an old digital file, so it's kind of grainy and low res. But that just makes it easier to make this all work, so I don't have to be that precise. So I'm gonna take my lasso tool and just kind of circle around his head, and I don't have to get that close. Just want to make sure that I don't cut into his head, because we're going to edit this selection here. Okay, so we've drawn a selection around it. Now I want to visualize it, because I don't want a hard edge, I want a soft edge, and I'd like to visualize what that looks like. So I'm going to go into my quick mask mode here. And here the quick mask is the default red color, but since the image is sort of warm toned, I think it might be easier to visualize the mask if I can change the color of that mask. So I'm going to go to my channels panel here and go to my quick mask options. So I go down here and select quick mask options, and if I click on the color here, I can change the color to something a little more contrasty. And we'll make it kind of a dark blue. And okay, so now you can see how much easier it is to see that edge. In fact, let's make this mask a little more opaque. Let's make it like 80% opaque. So now I can really see, the character of that edge. So what do I want to do? I want to blur this edge. And rather than blurring the whole document, I'm actually going to make a selection around the part that I want to blur, which is just this part in here where the head is. And I can go here to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and just, I want to get a soft edge there. So now I can see that's the kind of softness I want. Probably, since I like round numbers, I'm going to just stick with 5 here. And now maybe I'd like this edge to get a little closer, so I can use the minimum filter here and see how I can shrink it in closer to the head. Now, that's using the filters, but we can, of course, use a brush. So if I take my brush and I'll drop the selection that I have, Command D drops the selection. So now I'm going to paint into this quick mask here with the brush, and I'll use black paint. Make my brush a little bit smaller here, and I can Can brush kind of closer to the edge, like so. And I think I'm going to leave a little bit around the hair because I want to preserve the hair wisps. And his head is going to go back in a very similar place in the other document. So I'm not that worried about making a super tight selection here. Okay, now that I've edited my quick mask, I can hit the Q key again. And now we're back to our head with the marching ants. And this is the fun part. I'm going to get my Move tool, which is this little tool at the top of the tool panel here. The Move tool is going to allow me to move this head into the other document. And here's the tricky part. The other document is under this tab. Let's kind of zoom in a little closer here. And I want to move this head into this document. So I'm in this document, this tab is forward. I'm going to get my Move tool. You see it looks like little scissors now because it's going to cut this head out of the background and we're going to place it on top of the other document. So I'm going to click and drag, you know, there it comes. It's separating away. And I'm going to go up to the other tab until the tab comes forward. And I still have my finger on the mouse. And I'm going to move down and drop it and it'll go right on top. Now let's look at what happened. We're in our layers panel and there we've made a new layer. And this layer is the head. And we can kind of approximate where it is. And I can turn this layer on and off by clicking on the little eye icon. So there's the underlying layer. There's the new layer with the head in it. Sort of happy, sad. Happy, sad. You can do a little animation with this. But I can see that my head's not really lined up. I'd like to get this head in a little bit better position. And I can, you know, do by trial and error here, and I can see, well, the rotation is off. So in order to make it really match up properly, I need to kind of rotate it so it fits in the neck and everything the same way. So what we're going to do is change the opacity of this layer so we can see through it. And so you get close to 50%, so we can see, I can see where the eyes are, right? So if I use the Move tool and kind of move it around, I can line up. My strategy usually is I'm going to line up the highlight of one of the eyes, and here I can see, you know, it's not in the right rotation, so this eye's not lining up. So now we're going to do a transform to rotate this object so that it lines up better with the head underneath it. And that's under the Edit menu. And we're going to go down here to Free Transform. So we get a bounding box, and this is very similar to the transformation of selections that we might have done. But in this case, we're actually transforming that object, the head, that's in the layer. There's a little X right in the center of this bounding box. If you look for where these center points cross, right in the center there's a little moving marker here. I'm going to place that right over the eye. And the reason I'm going to do that is that when I rotate this, I want it to rotate around the eye that's already lined up. And I'm looking to get these two highlights to merge. So if you notice, as I go outside of this bounding box, the cursor changes and indicates this little arrow that shows that you can rotate. So I'm going to click and drag, and I'm looking to get those eyes lined up. And there, you see? Now the eyes lined up. Now I can go back to my full opacity, and I can commit to the transformation by hitting the little X here or double-clicking inside of the transform box. Okay, now let's see how well we did. There you go. It's almost exactly in the same position. And, you know, maybe we can use the arrow keys on the keyboard to nudge it just a little bit like that. I think that's a little better. There we go. Okay, so you saw how we dragged the head from this document, and now you can see it's actually still in the same position even though it looked like it was moving away. Because I dragged it out of the document, it sort of popped back into its normal position. And I can drop the selection, and I'm as good as gold here. No change has happened. But over here now, I have a layer with a head. And that is how you can fix a group shot where it often is totally impossible to get everybody with no blinks and with a great expression. You'll find an opportunity to use this, I'm sure. Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at some very basic techniques for Photoshop. You can find much more advanced information on my website and my blog. I also have a YouTube channel with lots of video tutorials, and you can follow me on Twitter to find out about my various classes and workshops. Thank you, and I will see you in the next tutorial.